Hello everyone, welcome to another talk with Professor Reha. I want to talk about a phrase I hear occasionally on social media, the phrase of late-stage capitalism. Because I want to explain to people that late-stage capitalism happened almost a century ago, and what we have now is actually a just shifted form of capitalism as a result of that late-stage capitalism, which, again, for emphasis, happened almost a century ago. What do I mean? Well, first, let's go back, because in order to understand when and how late-stage capitalism happened and what we have now, we have to go back to the beginnings, so to speak. And I'm going to do a TLDR of both the history of economics and capitalism and a variety of the ideas. I'm going to simplify a lot of this, so if you are familiar with economics and I pass over something, that is purely for the point of brevity. Otherwise, I'd be here for hours. So, we go all the way back to the Renaissance, where essentially I'm going to summarize the Renaissance in terms of capitalism as where a lot of the foundational ideas began to form in the Renaissance. Okay, this is where we can trace back the origins of paper money. This is where we can trace back the origins of banking. This is where we start to see some of the fundamental ideas of capitalism forming. However, it wasn't until the late 1700s, more specifically for a lot of people, but not necessarily 100% accurate, the publishing of the book by Adam Smith in 1776, if I remember correctly, The Wealth of Nations. The actual title is longer, that doesn't matter, most people know it by the title The Wealth of Nations. Now, in this book, Adam Smith lays out sort of the code of capitalism. But one of the most interesting pieces of this book, and the one that I really want to focus in on because this really effectively explains basic capitalism, which is what I call this, is known as the invisible hand theory. The invisible hand theory essentially states, in plain English, that human greed will self-regulate the economy. A shopkeeper in a village who wants to succeed will undercut his competitor by as much as he can while still making a profit, and pay as much as he can his employees in order to draw the best talent. That is sort of a summary of the basic ideas. Here are some examples. If you're chuckling to yourself or something because that's not how it works today, you're correct. You are 100% correct. There is reasons for this which are best exemplified by skipping from 1776, skipping about 150 years of capitalism and going right to the 1920s, known in America as the Roaring Twenties. I believe England also refers to it as this, which is widely regarded as the most profitable decade in America's history until it crashed in 1929. Now, in the 1920s, America had what could essentially be considered the purest form of capitalism, because one of the things that Adam Smith was talking about in The Wealth of Nations was the role of government in the economy, which is to say, almost none. According to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, governments really shouldn't interfere too much in business outside of preventing monopolies from forming, because obviously monopolies are bad for the economy and for business. So Adam Smith's point of view, and the popular point of view since The Wealth of Nations up to 1920s, the predominant capitalist view was governments really should not interfere in the economy or business too much. Taking a very, in English, a hands-off approach. There's a French term, laissez-faire. I probably butchered that pronunciation because I suck at French and I apologize, but it was a widespread economic concept at the time, a widespread economic philosophy, so to speak. And this was what America was essentially employing in the 1920s. There was very little federal regulation of businesses. What regulation did exist was primarily statewide, rather than by the federal government. And in the first half of the 1920s, arguably the first 3/4 of the 1920s, everyone was making money. Absolutely everyone. Everyone had great wages, reliable jobs. Everyone had a car, except for those who couldn't drive because they were too young, mostly. You had everyone was pretty much profitable, right? Again, most profitable decade in American history. And then late 1927, early 1928, depending on how much you believe the data, people stopped buying the big ticket items. People stopped buying cars because people didn't need 12 cars back then, they only needed one. People stopped buying appliances, people stopped buying houses because everyone had a house, etc. Right, so people stopped buying these big ticket items, but of course, because capitalism really emphasizes the human greed, the businesses that were selling these big ticket items, despite declining sales, expanded more. They built more factories, they hired more people to build products that nobody was buying anymore. Cue a year later, or half a year later, again, depending on how you run these, how much you believe the data at the time, but anywhere from 6 to 12 months later, you start seeing these companies producing the big ticket items going down. They start going bankrupt because, lo and behold, or at least they're not necessarily going completely bankrupt, a lot of the times they're closing factories, they're shrinking their production, and people are losing jobs. These people are obviously going to the banks, and they are trying to withdraw their money because at this point they'd been putting all their money into savings accounts or investing it in stocks because, of course, the stock market was shooting through the roof at the time because everyone was making money, right? Now, initially this wasn't really a big deal, but as more companies began to sort of shrink production, they were closing factories, people were losing jobs, people began selling their stock investments if they had invested or withdrawing their savings because they needed to rely on the money they'd saved up / invested in order to survive until they could find a new job. And this began to cascade. You know, we had started with the big ticket items, then as the stock value of other companies, the stocks of other companies was being sold by these formerly employed people, the stock price, of course, dropped because now the market was being flooded with stocks, and it just cascaded. Unfortunately for the public at large, whether or not you intended your money to be invested in stocks, it was invested in stocks. Because at the time, again, there was really no regulation, including on banks. So what the banks were doing with the savings accounts of people who had put their money in just to be saved and didn't want to invest it, the banks were investing that money assuming the stocks would just always go up and that they could pay these people back later. But of course, when people started losing their jobs and we started seeing a sort of death spiral of stock prices, that was no longer true. So even people who hadn't invested in stocks lost their money to the stock market. If this sounds like what happened with FTX, it is. This is exactly what happened with FTX, and the only reason FTX wasn't as bad as it was is because by the time FTX rolled around, essentially, there were enough people skeptical of cryptocurrency that not the entire country was invested in FTX. In fact, if you expanded FTX out to the point where all of America was invested in FTX or had put their money in FTX, we would have had the exact same thing happen. Okay? It is essentially the same problem. The only real difference here is, again, the scale. A overwhelming majority of Americans, whether or not they wanted it to be, had their money in stocks. Same thing with FTX, just with cryptocurrency instead of stocks. So, this was where capitalism failed, and in fact, when the big ticket items stopped getting sold, that was late-stage capitalism. That very specifically was late-stage capitalism for basic capitalism. Okay? So, capitalism failed in the 1920s. I want to make it very, very clear that capitalism as an economic structure by itself does not work. This eventually happens. Okay? That was pure capitalism. So, what do we have now then? Well, a absolutely amazing video by Second Thought, a channel called Second Thought, which the title of that video is, I believe, Why You Aren't Immune to Propaganda. I'll link the video in the description below because I think it's one of the most important videos on YouTube currently. And an amazing creator, by the way, Second Thought, huge fan of his. But Second Thought terms this as neoliberal capitalism is what we have today, but how do we get from basic capitalism as outlined by our old friend Adam Smith to the neoliberal capitalism we have today? And are we in the middle of late-stage neoliberal capitalism? Well, short answer is yes, but let's walk through a little bit more of good old capitalism, the broad strokes of its history. So how do we get to neoliberal capitalism from basic capitalism? It failed in 1929. The government realized it needed to step in. What happened? Well, the government stepped in, which, in the banking world, was understandably necessary. I mean, the Great Depression was essentially the result of a complete lack of banking regulation, so that was fine. No one really had a problem with that at the time. You can argue that it wasn't maintained over the centuries, and I think you can argue very accurately for that, but that's a different conversation. Something else the government began doing, though, was interfering in other industries. The first one they hit was the food industry, where they would subsidize farmers for growing specific, really cheap crops, because, of course, it was the Great Depression, people were having a hard time affording food, so the government wanted to encourage farms to grow cheap food, like potatoes, for instance. The problem is that not all farms were in an area that was conducive to potato growing, and additionally, by growing the same crops over and over, they damaged their soil, and this eventually resulted in the Dust Bowl. This seems irrelevant, but it's a great indication that the government began interfering in industries well before they even understood said industries. The government did not understand the farming industry, and so the Dust Bowl happened, and this, if you look into any industry that the government has interfered with greatly, you can see where at some point the government kind of falls off the bandwagon, over-controls, and the industry has some sort of issue. Nothing is egregiously bad as the Dust Bowl. That was the first and greatest mistake the government did in regulation. But it's a really bad sign, and that's just what I want to emphasize here. And I'm not pro-business, by the way. I don't want you to walk away from this video thinking, oh, he's against regulating business. No. I'm for regulating business, but there's a limit, and I'll tell you why there is a limit. So, Dust Bowl happens, and, we're rolling towards the famous 1940s, specifically the late 1940s. Now, in the second half of the 1940s, two very interesting things happen. The first is, in 1946, lobbying was legalized. Now, the idea on paper, and what the public was told, was that the government clearly doesn't fully understand how to regulate most industries, often referring to the farming disaster known as the Dust Bowl as an example of this. So, in order to be better informed about these industries, the government decided that they would allow businesses to lobby, i.e., pay money to the government for a say in the regulations, because these big companies, these wealthy companies who could afford to lobby, would be the ones most familiar with and most interested in proper regulation. Behind the scenes, I suspect probably the government officials, Congress, etc., just wanted to sell power, which is really where I suspect we start shifting into neoliberal capitalism. True neoliberal capitalism. And I say that because, as I referenced, the Second Thoughts video talking about propaganda, this is where propaganda really became important to capitalism. the neoliberal capitalism that Second Thought references, because the very next year, according to history books, the Cold War starts. Now, obviously, that's a fairly arbitrary year to claim the Cold War started. Obviously, there'd been tensions beforehand, there'd been stuff going on behind the scenes before that, but officially, 1947 is when the Cold War started, and America needed to propagandize capitalism, because the Soviet Union was making a lot of accusations about capitalism, specifically American capitalism, and some of these were true. For example, the claim that capitalism is based on human greed. That is factual. That is factually true. That is what capitalism, basic capitalism, is based around. So, the government needed to propagandize capitalism. And there are a variety of ways that this happened. This is where the definition of the American dream came up, right? The American dream was a sort of nebulous definition. The idea of the American dream existed before this, but it was really solidified after this, during the Cold War, as, oh yeah, capitalism, all ships raise with the tides with capitalism, and, a car in every garage, a chicken in every pot, 2 kids for every family. This is where a lot of the stereotypical American propaganda originates from. Okay, not all of it, but a vast majority of it. And the reason why is because they wanted to defeat the Soviet Union's sometimes accurate, sometimes inaccurate claims about American capitalism. I'm not going to say that everything the Soviets said about capitalism was true or correct, but they hit a lot of sensitive points of capitalism that were entirely accurate and fair. And this rolls on, of course, through the Cold War to the modern day. One of the more recent, so to speak, results of this is the philosophical idea of effective altruism, which has a lot of different definitions, but one of the definitions that, at least from an economic point, I've heard fairly frequently, not the only definition, please keep in mind, but one of them is, well, in order to be effectively altruistic, you have to make as much money as possible and then donate it to fix problems across the world. As a lot of people will point out quite accurately with effective altruism, is that, strangely, effective altruism seems to really focus on things in other countries, rather than the problems we face at home. For example, there is a lot of talk by allegedly altruistic people of, okay, let's send money to such and such a poor country and help these people get water, for instance, right? There's a lot of, the poor and starving kids in Africa is a really great example. We see these advertisements every so often on television. We see them on the internet quite often. Okay, that's not a bad goal, but why are we just concerned about the poor in other countries? Why aren't we helping the poor and homeless in America, a number that has been rising, right? Why aren't we talking about the issues of legislating against not only regular people with a lack of minimum wage increases? Why aren't we also talking about healthcare? Why aren't we also talking about the rising costs of that? Why aren't we talking about the problems of trans people getting essentially illegal? To sort of summarize that problem, why aren't we trying to fix that problem in America? Why are we not talking about the drug addict problem in America, which has also been on the rise? Why are we not talking about the suicide rate in America, which has been on the rise? Why aren't we talking about the school shooting problem that's been on the rise in America? It's all well and good to want to help people in other countries, but you have to set your own home in order before you can even attempt to help others, because if your own home is disordered, how can you go to other people and claim you can help them when you can't even help yourself? But of course, the actual point of effective altruism is not actually to help anyone. It is simply to, essentially, at least from the definitions that I've seen and the way it's been used from my perspective, and fair play to proponents of effective altruism, I am cynical. So if you want to use that against me, that's fine. But all of the effective altruism I've seen has been performative and really intended to sort of clean up or whitewash the reputations of wealthy people who are exploiting or otherwise abusing the public at large, right? Bill Gates is a great example of this, in my opinion. But I'll get more into the details of that with another talk. It is worth mentioning that this sort of conceptual idea does come from neoliberal capitalism, and an argument can be made that we are in the late stage neoliberal capitalism, depending on how you perceive it. And I would have to agree, but a lot of people will ask, well, okay, so the government's basically been selling regulation for businesses for quite some time. Yes. But why hasn't anyone in the intervening space of time, which would be some, 70, 75 years? 75 years, let's approximate. Why hasn't anybody, fixed the problem? Well, there are two primary reasons why America has been declining, essentially, for quite some time. Both in terms of its freedoms, because America is no longer the land of the free. If you want the American dream, go to Finland, or Iceland, or any of those other, or New Zealand. A number of countries are more free than America, and quite frankly, it's easier to achieve the American dream in other countries. But anyways, back to the point. That's another conversation for a different time, but there are two essential problems here going on, two large-scale problems that I'm going to summarize. The first is obviously the selling of regulations and power to major businesses. This was very visible during the congressional hearing on TikTok, very, very obviously visible. Also, the congressional hearing on Facebook, highly visible. But you can see it in the lack of consistent minimum wage increases. You can see it in the removal of regulations, which is why we have the cargo train crashes, which is why we keep having bank failures like the Swiss bank failure. That was a removal of regulations. Again, going back to the problem of banks not being sufficiently regulated, which is 1929 all over again, just on a smaller scale. But anyways, that's one problem, right? The second problem is what is known in economies. Well, actually, there's three problems. I'll get to the third one in a bit. I almost forgot one because I'm not used to relating it, but I'll tell you why. Anyways, the second problem is what is known as the kick the can problem in economics. Essentially, even though the people in power recognize that there is a problem and that there needs to be a fix, they, in order to fix it at this particular point, and this has been the case since, I would say, the early 2000s, in order to fix the problem, they would have to break it. They would have to break it and fix it, put it back together. And nobody wants to do that because nobody wants to be the person known as the one who broke the economy, right? So what they do is they do patchwork on it, and they pretend the problem doesn't exist, or they minimize the problem, or otherwise downplay it, so that way they won't be the ones in power when everything goes to hell. Right? That's essentially what that problem is. That was a summary of it. There's obviously more. The third problem is economists, by and large, aren't really permitted to talk about corruption. When an economist, and this is part of the reason why economists are not as accurate as one would expect them to be, because if you've ever taken economic courses of any kind, whether as an elective in college or you study them incidentally as part of a finance degree or something like that, you might be wondering how economists can be wrong as often as they are when we have all of this science, we have all of this data available to us that economists can use to more accurately predict the economy. Why are they wrong as often as they are? Well, because one extremely important factor is always removed and they can't talk about it, which is corruption. Economists, and in fact a lot of economic conversation, doesn't like to talk about corruption for a couple of reasons. I'm going to summarize them here. This is something I want to talk about more in depth in a future talk. But one of the reasons is, quite honestly, a lot of economists are paid by the government or major businesses, both of whom benefit from corruption. So if they start talking about corruption, actually talking about corruption other than vague references to it while they dance around it, if they actually sit down and have a frank, honest conversation about corruption, they're in danger of losing their jobs. That's one thing. The second thing is that corruption is poorly tracked by nature of corruption, right? No one wants to write down in their accounting book, hey, I received a $2 million bribe from so-and-so company to pass such and such regulation. No one's going to do that, right? So tracking corruption can be very difficult. Obviously, the people who suck at it are discovered, but the people who are good at concealing corruption are also going to not leave behind as much data as those who suck at it, so it's really hard for economists to get a hold of data on corruption because by the nature of corruption, that data is either non-existent or really, really well hidden. And economists aren't real-life detectives. They sure can suss out things about the economy, yes. Very true. And they can probably make some educated guesses as to corruption and their effects on it, but again, they can't talk about that. So they're kind of in the dark. It's kind of like where they're trying to put together a puzzle, but they're missing a quarter of the pieces. Right? They'll never fully complete the puzzle because those quarter pieces are hidden around the room and some of them just aren't there in the first place. So even if they can grab some of the pieces that are hidden around the room, they're never going to have the full puzzle because some of those pieces just outright don't exist. Somebody came in beforehand, took some of those pieces and threw them into the fireplace and burned them. Right? You're never going to complete that puzzle. And that is why economists are wrong as often as they are. Well, those are some of the big reasons why economists are wrong as often as they are. And why, despite the fact that we theoretically understand economies better at this point, why things haven't improved. These are the broad stroke problems with the economy today. There's obviously a whole bunch of smaller problems. Some of these offshoots or results of these bigger problems that I talked about, some not. Well, 3 problems actually. But that is, to say late-stage capitalism isn't wrong in this day and age. I would argue with these people that they're not wrong when they say that. We are in late-stage neoliberal capitalism because basic capitalism failed nearly 100 years ago. Now, before I close out this video, I just want to reiterate, I did glaze over a ton here. For the purposes of brevity, I wanted to keep this roughly half an hour. I did successfully accomplish this. There is more, obviously, going on here. I just hit the big points. More to have this on record. There will be the link to Second Thoughts video on propaganda in the description, because I think everyone on YouTube should watch this, or at least listen to it. You don't necessarily have to visually watch it. You can just listen to it. That's how I consume like a majority of my YouTube content. I don't actually watch things, I just listen to them. So at the very least, listen to it. It's not that long of a video. I think it's a little shorter than this one. But with that being said, thank you very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.